Welcome to Agathos Ministries for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. This is Pastor Scott Conaway, and today we are picking up in Genesis chapter 11, talking about Abraham, and we're going to be moving forward from here. Let's review last week a little bit. The Tower of Babel. At the Tower of Babel, the world was divided into around 72 language groups, as best we know. And that may have happened around 100 years after the flood. Eber may have gotten to keep the original language with Noah, Shem, Arpachshad, and Shelah, which were Eber's ancestors that were still alive at the time. So that would mean that Noah's line down to Abraham would be able to communicate. Now this is about to be very important. That when Noah came through the flood with his sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, that they presumably all spoke the original language, which we will assume was Hebrew. Just a few generations later, Shem has Arpachshad, Arpachshad gives birth to Shelah, Shelah gives birth to Eber, and you have the Tower of Babel, where you have 72 different groups that get divided up into languages. We're assuming 72 languages, and that Eber, according to the tradition, gets to keep the original language. Now that means everybody else can no longer speak to Noah, Shem, Arpachshad, and Shelah because they don't speak the language anymore. Now, we don't know who else was involved, but we can assume that Eber, Noah, Shem, Arpachshad, and Shelah all still spoke Hebrew, and the rest very likely didn't. Now, today, we maintain generational lines down bloodlines with as few as one older generation to influence and lead us. Children typically will grow up with their parents. Sometimes not even with their parents, but with a parent. Grandparents are commonly in a child's life, but are not always leaders and teachers. Even grandparents that see their grandchildren on a regular basis are not normally considered a primary leader or primary teacher in their grandchildren's lives, and great-grandparents are even rarer as sources of wisdom and instruction. But, think about this for a second. If we knew and could trust the wisdom of previous generations, what might we learn? What if we knew that our grandparents really knew what they were doing? What if we knew our great-grandparents really knew what they were doing? And that we could get all of those stories, all of those principles, all of those ideas. Like, here's a quick example. Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. It is one of the most recommended books as a seminal book for anybody to read who wants to do high-end business. That if you want to know what it takes to become wealthy, that is one of the top recommended books, but it was compiled, researched, and written in the early part of the 20th century. The book is almost 100 years old as far as the material that's in it. And yet it is still considered one of the most important books for somebody to read if they're serious about getting wealthy. What if you had a chance to actually go sit and learn from Napoleon Hill when he was doing the research? In fact, what if you not only had a chance to sit and learn from Napoleon Hill, you had a chance to learn from the people he learned from? That you could sit down with Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford, and you could talk to them about, what did you learn? How did you do it? How did you make it work? What mistakes did you make? What mistakes can you help me avoid? Well, you had to learn the hard way, but you would like me to learn the easy way. And so on and so forth. There's all kinds of stories in the book that teach us valuable principles. What if you still had those people around and that you could learn greater wisdom instead of getting a snapshot from a moment in time when Napoleon Hill was dealing with them? You could get more of the story, more of the depth. That you could get the individual incidences and what they learned from it, and have all these different people who had experience in the 1800s and the early 1900s, during the Great Depression, between the world wars, during World War II, after World War II, and find out what's been consistent the whole time. Imagine that power. Now, also imagine that when we hear the stories, that we often get those stories without any way to check the facts. So we must rely on someone's memory, which, to be honest, from time to time, it can be very self-serving. People will tell us half of the story. fact, one of my personal pet peeves among pastors is when pastors use a story to illustrate a point in a sermon, but they only tell you half of the story because the other half of the story kind of discredits their point. I like to tell whole stories when I can. That if there's a pro and a con, I want you to understand both sides. But what if you had a whole team of fact checkers, people that would tell you the rest of the story, that if someone didn't tell you the whole story, well, that's okay, because this person over here will tell you the rest of the story, because they were there, they watched it unfold. Maybe they were one of the coaches or one of the mentors, and so they'll tell you, okay, now this is part of what's going on. The part they told you is good, but there's more to it than that, and you need to know. What if you had grandparents who told you their recollection of the story that your parents told you, and that they could clarify some of the details for you? What if you had someone else who remembered the event too? In fact, would it be handy to know that the stories were accurate and the lessons confirmed by multiple sources? Here's a couple of questions. If all that were true, you had the fact checkers, you had other people who were there, been there, done that, they could teach you the same principles, other people who saw the same events unfold, other people that could explain the apparent disparity in the stories, would you be more inclined to listen? Would you be more inclined to trust? If you knew that you were listening to the voice of personal experience and years of careful observation, would that be valuable? Would that be valuable? Be thinking about all of those while we start this. Using the year of the flood as year 0. Noah was 600 years old when the flood began. So, he was born with the flood as year 0 in year -600. He died in year 350 at 950 years old. So he died in 350. Now remember that year, 350. Shem was 98 years old when the flood came. So he was born in -98. And he dies in year 500 at 598 years old. So, but keep those dates in mind. Noah dies in year 350. Shem dies in year 500. So Noah and Shem. Noah came through the flood with the experience of 6 centuries of life before the flood. 600 years of what it was like to live under the conditions prior to the flood. Shem came through the flood with 98 years of experience of earlier life. Now keep in mind, not only do they come with their personal life experience, but they also come through with all of the lessons they learned from everybody that was alive. In fact, as I recall, Noah was the first one born after Adam died. So that means he's getting stories that date back generations, and is probably, even though Adam was dead when he was born, is getting the stories that Adam told because he's got generation after generation alive to pass along those stories. Shem came through the flood with 98 years of personal experience of earlier life, building the boat his entire life. Noah had direct experience with how the new rules impacted the rules of the world when he had his drunken episode. There was an episode when Noah got drunk. First time anybody getting drunk is mentioned in the Bible. So one of the hypotheses is that grape juice may not have fermented before the flood. And that Noah found out firsthand, like, oh, well, now we have this new thing. First time anyone getting drunk is mentioned. Both Noah and Shem knew what it was like to live as humans in a world of Nephilim, in a world that was filled with violence and had these men of renown, these men of old, had these giants, had these, whatever it was, whatever this weird thing going on that was connected to this Nephilim episode, whatever that was, the world was filled with violence. Even if all we're doing is we're dealing with human beings, the line from Adam to Noah surviving for centuries at a time in a world filled with violence. That's important to remember. And that they came through the flood with direct experience of God. Noah walked with God. The same phrase used, talking about Enoch, walked with God and was not. Noah walked with God and got brought through the flood. In Enoch's case, the world kept on going and Enoch was not. Enoch took off with God. And in Noah's case, Noah walked with God and then Noah gets to stay and the rest of the world gets to become not as God floods the whole world. And both Noah and Shem, of course, built the ark and came through the flood together. Now, however it happened, now we don't know, but however it happened, it was not long before humanity decided to rebel against the command of God to scatter, to fill the earth. Now, how did that happen? Did Noah and Shem tell stories that some of their descendants might have been better off not even hearing? Maybe. Maybe it was Ham and Japheth. Now, we already know Ham wasn't always the best behaved. That he made some mistakes. He thought that the negative humor making fun of his father was a good thing, and Shem and Japheth, handled dad much more honorably. They protected and preserved their father's honor. So we already know that we have some attitude and things, some honor issues going on. But, just as likely, they came up with it themselves. I mean, when someone has the right teaching, what do you have to do to get someone to get a wrong lesson? Usually nothing. They can come up with wrong lessons all by themselves. You don't have to go too far out of your way to teach someone a wrong lesson. Okay, continuing. We're heading from Noah going all the way toward Joseph, and we're going to make a few stops along the way. So we have Arpachshad. So we have Arpachshad born in year 2. So the flood ends. And within a couple of years, Shem's got a kid, Arpachshad. Arpachshad dies in the year 440. So he outlives Noah, but he dies before his father Shem. Arpachshad has Shelah in 37. So Arpachshad's 35 years old. He has a son, Shelah, and Shelah dies in 470. And then Shelah has Eber. Eber is born in 67. He dies in 497. Now remember, Shem dies in year 500. So far, Arpachshad, Shelah, and Eber both die before Shem. But they die after Noah, because Noah dies in 350. Now Eber and Eber's son Peleg. Eber is a third generation born after the flood. Eber named his son Peleg in honor of the division of languages, since Peleg was born in the year 101. That's how we guess that the Tower of Babel event happened about 100 years after the flood. By the time the fourth generation was being born, humanity was already getting in trouble again. There were 72 families by then. We don't know how big each of the families were, but there were 72 separate family groups. So Peleg, born in year 101. Now Peleg's going to die in the year 340. First one who's going to die before Noah. Now, he's only going to be a kid. He's only going to be, what does that work out to, 239 years old? Which, by the standards of what's been coming before him, he dies as a kid. But Peleg's son, Ru, is born in 131 when Peleg's 30 years old, and he dies in the year 370. So both Peleg and Ru lived the same length of life, fairly short lives by this point. But keep in mind, substantially over 200 years. Then Serug, Ru's son, is born in 163, and he dies in 393, 230 years old. Then Nahor. Nahor is born in 193, and Nahor dies in 341. Okay, so Nahor is pretty young when he dies. So if you take a look at that, what do you got here? You've got 148 years. That's getting pretty young now. And then Nahor is the father of Terah. And by the way, Nahor is the grandfather of Abraham. So Nahor has Terah in 222, and Terah won't die until 427. Now, something you may have noticed in here is who in this entire list dies after the year 500? Nobody. That means Shem is still around this whole time. But take note of this. Genesis 6:3. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his day shall be 120 years. Okay, this is often interpreted to mean that the lifespan of human beings will be limited to 120 years, although a lot of us think, okay, well, we would like to live at least that long, but we don't get close. But here's the thing to keep in mind. That's Genesis 6:3. Noah lived to be 950. Shem lived to be 598. After the flood, every one of Abraham's ancestors lived to be older than 120. Some of them by centuries. 438, 433, 464, 239, 239 again. 148. Abraham's grandfather was the kid. Lived to be 148. And Abraham's dad, 205. And Abraham would live to be 175. So if God is declaring in Genesis 6:3 that man it will not live past 120, 10 generations later, still hasn't gotten there. That probably tells us something, huh? And, of course, then we get to Abram himself. Abram was Abraham's birth name when he was born. God later renames him Abraham, inserting God's name, from Yahweh, in the middle of Abraham's name. He was born in 297. He gets called out of Haran, called out of this place called Ur, the biggest city at the time. Gets called out of Haran in 372. He's 75 years old when this happens. Ishmael is born in about 383. Isaac is born in 397. Abraham dies in the year 472. Did you catch that? Abraham dies in 472. When Abraham was born, your kid Abram, his father Terah was still alive. Okay, no surprise. Dad's alive when you're born. That's pretty common. His grandfather was still alive. Okay, that's pretty common too. Usually when most of us are born, our fathers and our grandfathers are very commonly alive. No one would think that was unusual. His great-grandfather Serug was still alive. These days that'd be a little bit more unusual, but Serug's father Ru was alive. Ru's father Peleg was alive. So you've got from Abram, his father Terah's alive, grandfather Nahor's alive, great-grandfather Serug's alive, great-great-grandfather Ru is alive, great-great-great-grandfather Peleg still around. So was great-great-great-great-grandfather Eber, great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Shelah. You can imagine trying to call someone by all these greats. We get rather unwieldy, because then we have Arpachshad still alive, who was the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, and Shem and Noah is alive. Great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Noah is alive when Abram is born. Now that's pretty stunning. Now, that means when Abram's growing up, he has 10 generations of wisdom and experience to educate him. Noah, with 6 centuries of pre-flood experience. 3 centuries of post-flood experience, was alive to coach, train, tell stories, and share and mentor Abraham until Abraham's 53 years old. Noah dies when Abraham is 53. How would you like to have half a century of coaching from someone with 900 years of life experience? What could he have learned from Noah? Can you imagine? Can you just imagine? Shem would be alive for all of Abraham's life. In fact, Shem outlived Abraham, who dies at the age of 175. Shem is still going to live another 28 years. Shem is alive for Isaac. Shem is alive for Jacob. Shem would not die until Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, until Jacob was 43. What could Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob learn from Shem? Think about that. I mean, that's just amazing when you start to consider things like that. Now, one of the most important things that Abram could have learned was how to have a relationship with God. What we are fairly certain is a polytheistic world, Abraham knew of God. In fact, when God called, Abram knew who it was that was calling him. Abram was not surprised to speak with God. That didn't surprise him. And Abram knew that God was worthy of unquestioned obedience and trust. So that tells you something. Abram knew something about God. Abram had enough of an understanding, enough of a relationship, recognized the voice of God clearly enough to leave home. Clearly enough to head off into a land he wouldn't know. Clearly enough to stop being city boy Abram and go be wandering nomad Abram. And not just to get up and leave the city and see, oh, whatever happens, happens, but then to be very, very successful, wandering around as a nomad with his nephew. And when you start to think about, okay, what are the ramifications of that? You lose the protection of city life. You lose, the organized police force. You're out there on your own. If you need to protect your staff, you've got to handle that yourself. You and your staff have to take care of that. 10 generations of coaches and mentors explains how city boy Abram could end up such a great shepherd. 10 generations of coaches, including Noah and Shem, who have all of the experience. We just came through the flood, and we've got all these animals on the boat. Got to know how to take care of them. Have to repopulate the entire earth. We don't have a whole lot of time. We don't have a whole lot of stock here. We need to get the numbers as big as we can, as fast as we can. So here's part of what we got going on here. Genesis 13, 5, and 6. Let's take a look and see how good is Abram as a nomadic shepherd. It says, now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. Okay, Abram and Lot running around together. Lot is Abram's nephew. And the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. Whoa, think about that for a second. Abram was so good at shepherding that he and Lot got so big that they could not keep their holdings close to one another. Now here's a way to think about it. Suppose you get Abram Incorporated. And Abram decides, well, I'm going to coach my nephew Lot. We're going to help Lot start his own business, Lot Incorporated. And Abram Inc. and Lot Inc. both keep growing, doing more business and more business until they start to get so big that they run into a problem. They can't both do business in the same city. That there's not enough suppliers, there's not enough shipping, there's not enough real estate. They can't both be in business in the same city because in order to do that, they have to stop growing. That they've reached this critical mass where it's already difficult for both of them to run. Both of them have plenty of room to grow. They just don't have the necessary supplies. They don't have the necessary real estate. The things that they need to be able to expand their business don't exist in this one city. And so what's going to happen is one of them needs to move. Now, in the narrative, we're told that somewhere in this mix, Abram takes Lot to the spot and says, okay, here's the deal. Here's a dividing line. You can go left, you can go right. Either way is fine. Since I'm more experienced, I can totally succeed either direction. I'm the one that coached you and mentored you. This has got some pros and cons over there, different pros and cons over there. Lot picks the place that he thinks he can do business best. He picks a place that happens to include the city of Sodom, where he decides he's going to move with his family and ultimately become one of the leaders in the city of Sodom. Later on, before God destroys Sodom, God's going to send a couple of angels in to go get Lot out, and ultimately only succeeds in getting Lot and Lot's 2 daughters out. The wife gets out, she turns around, wants to go back, turns into pillow of salt. You've heard the pillow of salt story. But before God destroys Sodom, there was a war, 4 kings against 5. And Lot gets kidnapped. And that leads us to a fight. And we're back to the 10 mentors, 10 coaches, 10 generations, including Noah, who spent 600 years living in a world that God says was filled with violence, living in a world that has this whole Nephilim thing going on, living in a world where he's watching 600 years of his ancestors alive, dealing with this world filled with violence, learning what it takes to survive here, spending a century with the sons, not able to run away. They're building a boat. They can't go anywhere. And 10 generations of teachers and mentors that learn from these people to continue to pass along the information. Those 10 generations helps explain how Abram was so good that he and his trained men just needed to be unsheathed to take down an army, multiple kings gathering their forces together in an army to rescue his nephew Lot. Genesis 14:14 and 15. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. 318 men, divides his forces, and defeats this army to rescue Lot. Now, this is the one fight, the only actual fight Abraham had that is recorded in the Bible. Now, there may have been others, but this is the only one that God thought worth mentioning. Now, one, of course, great likelihood is that this was the most unusual one. This was the biggest one. And that God wants us to know 318 men are taking out armies. Now, one interpretation, because there's a whole way of the Hebrew converts to numbers and back and forth again, I have heard the interpretation that it was actually just Abram and his chief servant Eleazar, because the number 318 happens to correspond numerically with what the Hebrew letters mean numerically for Eleazar. I've heard it. I tend myself to go with the 318. I mean, that's impressive already. Yeah, I don't think you need to drop down to just 2. But other than this, Abraham's men would have had to see to the security of his flocks. I mean, the flocks have to be defended. They have to deal with bandits who are going to try to steal part of the flock. I mean, it's valuable. I mean, think about just the days of cattle wrestling, horse thieves, the Wild West in America. And consider what all this stuff was worth back then. And consider that Abraham does not have the protection of a government. I mean, there's no sheriff that's going to come out to help out Abraham. You're not going to have the town marshals going to come up with the posse to go chasing down them horse thieves. I mean, Abraham and his men have got to take care of their own stuff. So we got experience dealing with bandits and wild animals, too. I mean, much, much later on, there's a story of David, and he says he has to take on bears, he has to take on lions in order to protect the flocks. So who knows what else Abraham's men had to deal with. But here's the thing that's interesting. God makes it a point to tell us that they were Abram's trained men. they trained. That means someone's training them. In what? How does city boy Abram have anything he can teach all of these guys born to him in his staff, in his house, in his nomadic tribe, if he doesn't know anything? I mean, where's the city boy learn how to defend flocks and herbs? Much less being the shepherd, how does he learn how to be the warrior? Well, once again, we're back to 10 generations. Noah and Shem would benefit from centuries of experience. Because they were still around, they could also correct their own mistakes. So not only do you have 10 generations of stories being passed down, because they're still alive, they get to have their experience and benefit from their experience. They go, no, we taught it this way back. Okay, Arpachshad, do you remember when we taught you guys this way? And then by the time we're getting down to Ehud and they start to build the tower, we realized we probably really shouldn't have been telling some of these stories the way we were telling them. Yeah, the days before the flood, those were some pretty good days. We had some stuff that God destroyed in the waters, but, part of the whole point was that was a problem, and maybe we shouldn't have been telling those stories. That maybe we should have focused more attention on, the relationship with God, because they all came around and said to rebel against God. God says scatter, and they said, no, we're not going to scatter, we're going to stay here and build a tower. So they would learn from their mistakes. They would see the effect of the causes they set in motion. And you've got centuries of impact, and you're going to be around to watch centuries of impact. You've got some motivation to try to make sure you get it right. Because you're going to be watching this going on for century after century after century. To get your teaching down, get your parenting down, to coach and mentor your kids and grandkids and great-grandkids and so on and so on, because you're going to be here. Because they were still around. They could correct their mistakes. If they saw that what they did was a mistake, they had centuries to correct their mistakes. They could clarify. Say, okay, you misunderstood. The point I was trying to make was this. I see you got that part. I understand how you got that part. But let me clarify. This is what I was teaching. They could explain. So if there's any ambiguity, well, that's okay. You can still go ask Noah and Shem. They're still around. And they could reteach something as many times as it took for the proper lessons to be learned. So they had virtually infinite time as far as, relative to us. We have decades. They had centuries. Imagine the power of having 10 generations of fact checkers. 10 generations of people saying, I remember that. Back, my recollection of it, you got Noah, you've got Shem, you've got Arpachshad, you've got Serug, you've got Ehud, I think I missed somebody, Ru, all of which were around watching this whole Tower of Babel thing going on. And then you got Peleg, who was born right around the time it was going on. And he could even go, well, actually, the last time you told the story, you said. And so you could get a lot of clarity. 10 generations of fact checkers. Imagine the powerful of having 10 generations of experiments. 10 generations of experimentation going on, where you get to see the effect over decades, over centuries, of what it is that you're teaching. You get to watch all the things. Now, I'll tell you something that I found interesting. Talking to parents of adult children. One of the things almost every single parent of an adult child has ever told me, that they can reflect back on their adult child's childhood. And they can see some of the things now they wish they had taught their child that they didn't ever even think of when the child was younger. Sometimes that they see things that they inadvertently taught the child, often by example, or that they didn't realize was really going on, that they wish they had addressed, they wish they had done differently. And I've also talked to grandparents who, after not only are the children adults, that their children are parents and their children are raising their grandchildren, they're watching something from the perspective and experience of a grandparent, and they're realizing, whoa, wait a minute, I just realized something. I've just learned something now in my 50s and my 60s that I didn't realize when I was your age raising you. If I would have known then what I know now, I would have done this differently. And they want to teach their children that they would do differently so that their grandchildren can be raised better. One of the problems, of course, and this was one particular grandmother said, the problem that I have is that when I was their age, I wouldn't have listened to my mother. And so here I am, I'm trying to tell my child how to raise my grandchild and realizing, despite my frustration that they won't listen to me, that I wouldn't have listened when I was their age either. And part of it is figuring out, so how do I do that? But you've got 10 generations. You think maybe they might know what they're doing. Imagine the power of having 10 generations of people passing down a collective thousands upon thousands of years of personal experience. Thousands upon thousands of years of close observation. Thousands of years saying, when you're doing this, you don't realize what's going to happen, but let me tell you, 50 years later, 100 years later, 200 years later, it snowballs into this. And you need to put this course in motion, because if you're going to be playing this game for over a century, if you're going to be playing this game for 100, 200, 300, 400 years, you can't go down that path. That's a bad path. And you can burn yourself out in just a mere 50 years, and you'll begin to spend the next century or 2 or 3 or 4 centuries having to live with that. Imagine the power of having that kind of experience, of having that kind of wisdom being handed down to you. Continuing the genealogy, we have Isaac, born in 397. So Noah's dead now. He dies in 577. We now got to the first person who dies after Shem. Jacob, born in 457, went to Egypt in 587. He dies in 604. And Joseph, who's born somewhere around 544 and dies somewhere around 654 at 110 years old. So in Jacob, born 457. Okay, born 457. That means Shem is still around. Of course, his father Isaac is still alive at that time. And so we have generations of teachers still available for Jacob for his wrestling match. Genesis 32, starting in verse 24. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." "But," he said, Jacob, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Continuing with verse 27. So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." He said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him and said, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And the implication there is, you know who I am. You don't need my name. And he blessed him there. So who did Jacob think he was? Genesis 32:30. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved." So Jacob's take on this man is this man that he was wrestling with all night was God. And Jacob's match lasted all night long. Now, I've heard some teachers teach that he was wrestling with God in prayer. But for those of us who might want to think that, to show as a real grappling match, God tells us that the man dislocated Jacob's hip. Okay, if you're wrestling with God in prayer and you get your hip dislocated because God touches you there, something's going on. It actually makes a lot more sense in the narrative if he's actually having this physical match. Because we know at this particular period in history that God is still showing up as a man. I mean, he came by to chit-chat with Abraham before he went and had Sodom destroyed. So we know God's still doing stuff like that at this time. So the question is, how was Jacob so good at jiu-jitsu, so good at wrestling, that he could grapple all night long. That takes some serious skill. Anyone who's trained for wrestling or jiu-jitsu knows how exhausting it is to grapple for minutes, much less hours. And where did Jacob get that kind of skill? Even with a dislocated hip, Jacob could still hold on. With a dislocated hip, you've got to have some serious technique. Now, we do have this phrase when God says, let me go, and Jacob won't let him go. And let me explain this a little bit. Some people might not quite understand this without an explanation, but when a master is training with a junior person, there are a lot of techniques that the junior person could use that actually put the junior person in danger, where the master could deal with it easily, but not without hurting the junior person. Like in my particular case, we have a chokehold that locks in the skeleton, and so there's a way of using your arms and using your hands to do a skeletal hold where someone cannot escape from the hold, and the most ordinary conditions. Now, there are some ways out. One of my acquaintances is a grandmaster, and he was visiting, and he was showing an escape from a sleeper hold, which is a more common chokehold variation. And I told him, okay, if you're going to ask one of my students to put you in a chokehold, let me show you. This is the hold they're going to put you in. It's not a sleeper hold, and it's not a traditional wrestling choke. It's not a traditional jiu-jitsu choke. Let me show you how it works. And I showed him, okay, this is how you lock it in. This is how you do it. This is how you even hide the fingers. And he said to my students, if you can get in the choke that your instructor is teaching you, there is no escape. You need to escape before it gets locked in. Now, that actually isn't 100% true. It's that there's no way out. There's no escape, meaning there's no way to get out without causing harm. Now, Jacob was determined enough that he held on anyway, that he refused to let go. So the had not prevailed probably was the could not defeat, but the could not get Jacob to give up. I mean, the fact that God could physically dislocate Jacob's hip tells you, okay, God could do as much damage to Jacob as he needs to do to Jacob if his goal is to beat Jacob. But he wasn't. The had not prevailed, if you interpret the Hebrew words there as could not, or could not get Jacob to give up, he's testing Jacob's determination and proving that Jacob is as determined, that he wants the blessing of God. He is determined to stay in contact with God, to wrestle with God, physically, even physically. When Jacob can't beat this guy, I mean, the best he can do is hold on to him. Can't beat him, but Jacob realizes who he's fighting. Jacob realizes who he's dealing with, and he wants that blessing. Now, what's some of the impact, though, of what's happening around this time? Let's back up a little bit to Abraham. When Abraham was born in 297, all 10 generations from Noah to Abraham were still alive. Abraham had the benefit of 10 generations of teachers, 10 generations of mentors, 10 generations of coaches. By the time Isaac was born in 397, half of Abraham's ancestors that were alive when Abram was born are now dead. 5 of them are left, not counting Abraham himself. So Isaac has Abraham and 5 other generations, 6 generations, where Abraham had 10 generations. Abraham and half of what Abraham had would be alive to be teacher, mentor, and coach to Isaac. By the time Jacob was born in 457, 3 previous generations are left. So now Jacob's got Abraham and Isaac and 3 prior generations left to coach him, which does include Shem. I mean, so Shem, he knows some stuff. He's got half a millennia of experience at this time. Jacob had his father, grandfather, and only 3 of the 10 generations left alive to be teacher, mentor, and coach. And by the time Jacob went to Egypt in 587, Jacob was the eldest of his line. As the elder, the single solitary, the oldest one left. Every single generation that was still alive when his grandfather Abram was born is now dead. Abraham has died, Isaac has died, Jacob is the elder. And whatever it was he who needed to pass it down now. Now it's all him. It's all him. Genesis 46:26. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt as direct descendants, not including the wives of Jacob's sons, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. The wisdom of the ages was probably passed down through Jacob and his line in this moment of time. Possibly only 70 men knew it. And we don't know how much of it they might have known. But if Jacob was the final repository, and that Jacob passes it on through his sons, and it gets passed down through his grandsons, and you could have been down to 70 people. And Jacob is the last surviving patriarch that continue passing this along. So keeping the truth alive. From these 70, there was enough distinctiveness in their culture, enough distinctiveness to the way they thought, enough distinctiveness in their knowledge and their skills that they maintained a separate identity as a people for over 400 years. And their numbers would grow to the millions. Estimates are anywhere from 1.5 million up to about 5 million people. It's likely that 10 generations before and after the flood had a long-standing tradition of careful generational teaching. I mean, Noah was still alive. 10 generations later, Noah's still alive. So you can figure they probably taught generation after generation. Not like today, where usually it's just the parents teaching the kids and the grandparents have very little to do with it. The great-grandparents have almost nothing to do with it. You know, if your great, just add up the greats, still relatively young. I mean, Shem outlived Abraham. 10 generations later, Shem's still around. 10-generation grandson is dying. Shem's still around. So there's likely a very, very strong generational teaching tradition that went back from Adam. That Adam was around for generation after generation after generation afterward. Noah's around for several generations. Shem's around for even more generations. But then it falls to Jacob and his sons to not just teach what they knew, but to teach even the idea of maintaining the generational teaching, maintaining the teaching generation after generation after generation. Now here's a couple of possible blessings. The Hebrews maintained their cultural identity for 400 years. Now imagine how hard that is. Now part of this might have been helped because their original profession as shepherds was despised by the Egyptians. The Egyptians didn't much care for shepherds, that it was considered just this horrific thing to be doing, this very, very despised profession. And so there wouldn't be much mixing. So that could have been a blessing of God, either a blessing of God to go to Egypt, blessing of God that the Egyptians don't like them, a blessing of God that they're probably not going to get along very well with the Egyptians. They're going to be allowed to be there because of Joseph. But they're not going to get along with the people. That could have been a blessing of God to help them stay separate because the Egyptians would not like them. Now, there might have come a time, you put enough generations in it, the people group's getting large enough, where they might have started to assimilate, which could have been as simple a thing as there's so many of them that maybe not all of them are going to be shepherds now. But when a quote-unquote Pharaoh who did not know Joseph arose, the Hebrews were enslaved. So even the slavery, though, might have been a blessing of God to protect their cultural identity because, as slaves, they would not assimilate to the culture and the gods of their masters. And obviously, as despised as you would be as a shepherd because they don't like shepherds, well, now you're a slave. So you're going to be even more separated. Later, God protected generations of culture and knowledge by his written word. God's ways could be lost for generations at a time. And when his written word was found, or a prophet arose, everything could come to life again. God always has a plan to protect his ways. Even if a portion of his ways gets lost for a generation, or 2 generations, or 10 generations. Even when King David, didn't know what to do, got in trouble on moving the ark, somewhere along the line, they find the Torah. And they look it up and go, hey, well, this has been lost for centuries. We didn't know this was the way you're supposed to transport. No wonder it didn't work. That God always has a plan to protect his ways. Do we have a plan? Do we have a plan to work in cooperation with him? God has his plan. Do we work with him? So learning what you can. Imagine what gets lost when a generation dies having never taught. Just imagine. Just imagine your lifetime, your stories, your lessons, your insights, and your wisdom. All the things that you've learned that you think you would like the next generation to know. Imagine if they might not figure it out by themselves. Lifetimes of stories, lessons, insights, and wisdoms can vanish. Never told, never remembered. And then here's the tough part. And mistakes. Mistakes made again and again and again. By generations who never gleaned wisdom from the example of how to do it right, or learned from the warning of what can happen if you do it wrong. Virtually every story is an example or it's a warning. Most people's lives are examples and they're warnings. Some people's lives are almost entirely example and a few warnings. Some people's lives are almost entirely warning and only a few examples. Almost nobody's life is 100% one way or the other, but boy, if your story is told, you want your story in the example column. You do not want your story in the warning column. You want maybe 1 or 2 stories in the warning column, but you want to keep as many of your stories that you choose that on the path that you pick to be in the example column. Abraham had 10 generations of teachers. Now, we seldom have more than 2. Or do we? By using various resources, we actually have more opportunity than Abraham did. We have centuries of books. In fact, we have more books in print than we could ever read. More new books coming out year by year than you could ever keep up with. We have audios. We have videos. We have teachers and mentors and coaches. Now, we may not have a 900-year-old ancestor to tell us nearly 1,000 years of cool stories, and 9 other generations of even more cool stories and great lessons and personal experience from all these people that can teach and explain, but what can we learn? Who can we become? Maybe we don't need to be the master shepherd mentoring our nephew. Maybe we don't need to have 318 trained men that we can unsheath to defeat government armies. But just imagine, what can we learn? What legacy can we leave? If we become God's best us, what might we accomplish? If we become God's best us, how might that impact the next generation? If we started thinking in terms of decades, if we started thinking in terms of lifetimes, if we started thinking in terms of generations, if we started thinking in terms of centuries worth of generations, what might we start doing differently today? If today was going to be what the rest of our lives would be like, what would we do today, tomorrow, this week, to start not just us as individuals. As an individual, I can think of myself individually in terms of day, week, month. What if I think of myself as a course? That I have a direction to move, and that there will be others from other generations behind me that will follow. Now, a generation might not be my biological children. I mean, that's the obvious way of thinking generations. A generation could be my students. My students could actually be older than me. The next generation student to me could be older than me when they train. I mean, I'm 43 when I'm recording this right now. What if I have a student who's 50? Well, that's my student. If then that 50-year-old has another student, then the 50-year-old student is 60. Well, that's my grand-student, and then great-grand-students, and so on and so forth. So the generations, you don't have to think about necessarily being physically younger than you. But who are you teaching? Who are you leading? Who will they teach? Who will they lead? That's generations too. What if I am starting a generational line? What do I need to be doing differently today? What do I need this week to look like? What do I need this month to look like? If what I do, if the course that I walk is going to be walked out for centuries worth of generations, what an honor. What a responsibility. What a tremendously sobering stewardship. To think in terms of decades, lifetimes, generations, centuries worth of generations. To think of the compass heading that I am leading who knows how many generations on. What do I need to do differently today? What do I need to do differently this week, this month, this year? What choices do I make and which way do I go as I consider what legacy can I leave? Because I am not going to have 350 to 500 years to keep fixing whatever mistakes I might make. I need to get it right in decades. What can I be learning? What can I be reading? What seminars? What books? What audios? What training can I have? Even just what decisions of what I already know do I need to put into action? What in my life do I need moving forward so that I can put my entire life as best as I can, as much of it as I can, in that example column? Father God, we pray your hand and your blessing upon us to praise you and honor you with our legacy, to praise you and honor you with thinking in terms of generations, centuries worth of generations, and the impact that we can have. We're not going to be around for 350 years, 400 years, 500 years to teach and to train and to keep on learning. That for us, we're here, relatively speaking, for such a short time. But let our lives praise you. Let our choices praise you. Let us be examples to those who follow us and those who follow us, that our story might inspire, that we might lead and we might teach and we might mentor by the life that we live, and that we can praise you, Lord, with who we are, with who we become, and with the course of our lives. In Jesus' name.